In December 2016, the Treasurer of Australia approved the sale of a cattle empire for $386.5 million. The buyer was the nation's richest woman, Gina Rinehart, with a Chinese company holding a third of it. And it had taken a fight to get there. Twice the government had blocked a Chinese bid outright because part of this land sat under a secret weapons range and because the thing being sold was simply too big to let go lightly. How big? At its peak, it had run to around 3% of the entire Australian mainland, one man's holding larger than nations, the largest private landholding in the modern history of the world. And the whole of it, every acre, every head of cattle, every red mile of it, began with a runaway boy, 5 shillings in his pocket and a one-eyed horse. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The Boy with 5 Shillings. He was born near Athelston, in the low green foothills above Adelaide, on the 9th of May 1857. His father George, a farmer, was dead before Sidney's first birthday, and the boy grew up one of several sons of a widowed mother, Elizabeth. There was schooling in the ordinary way of it at Norwood, but almost nothing about the child suggested what was coming. What he had, and it is the only thing every account agrees on, was a restlessness that a small farm outside Adelaide could not hold. So he left. In about 1870, at the age of 13, Sidney Kidman ran away from home with everything he owned, which came to 5 shillings and a horse. And not a good horse. The animal was blind in one eye, and the boy, with the black humour of a child who has nothing, named it Cyclops, after the one-eyed giant of the Greek myths. Sit with the arithmetic of that for a moment. 5 shillings, a half-blind horse, a 13-year-old with no father, no land, no trade, and no schooling to speak of, riding out into some of the harshest country on earth. If you'd been asked that day to pick the boy least likely to end up controlling 3% of a continent, you would have picked him. There is a strange accident of timing worth pausing on. Just a few hundred miles away, and only about 3 years older, another poor colonial boy was riding out into the same hard country in the same decade. His name was Ned Kelly. One of these boys would take what he wanted with a gun and hang for it before he was 26. The other would take what he wanted with an eye for cattle and a genius for country, and die a knight of the realm with a mile-long funeral. Same era. Same poverty. 2 completely different answers to it, and that difference is the whole reason this story is worth telling. Kelly became a folk hero for what he took. Kidman became a national institution for what he built, and the country he built it in gave nothing away for free. The inland of the 1870s killed the unprepared through thirst, through heat, through distance so vast a man could ride for a week and see no roof but the sky. It broke strong men and rich men, and men with far better prospects than a half-blind horse and 5 shillings to their name. Nobody, looking at that boy, could have called what came next inevitable. It only looks inevitable now, because we know how it turned out. Because there is a version of Kidman's story people prefer, in which the empire is built on luck, on being in the right place, on a lucky hand of cards. Hold that thought, because it is wrong. What Kidman had was not luck. It was an eye, and it was about to be sharpened by the finest teacher he would ever have. The boy's real education did not happen in a classroom at Norwood. It happened in a hole dug into the bank of a dry creek. And the man who taught him there would shape everything that followed. Chapter 2. What Billy Taught Him. The boy made his way Bentuit north into the Barrier Range, that hard-broken country on what is now the border of New South Wales and South Australia. An older brother found him a start, and Sidney went to work at Poola Macca, and then at Mount Gipp Station, as a roustabout and a bullock driver, the lowest hand on the place. At one point he asked for a rise and was sacked for the cheek of it. And here is a detail worth holding, because the whole story circles back to it. Mount Gips Station sat directly on top of what would soon become the richest silver, lead and zinc lode ever found anywhere in the world, the Broken Hill deposit. The sacked bullock driver was, quite literally, walking over a fortune and had no idea it was there. But the most important thing that happened to Sidney Kidman in those years was not a station or a wage. It was a friendship. He shared a dugout, a rough shelter cut into the dry bank of a creek, with an Aboriginal man the white stockman called Billy. And from Billy, the boy learned the thing that would make him. He learned to read country, where the water still sat, hidden, beneath a bone-dry riverbed. How to find feed in a landscape that looked, to a European eye, like nothing but red death. How to move stock across distances that would kill any animal, driven by a man who did not know the ground. The Australian Dictionary of Biography puts it plainly and without decoration. For the rest of his life, Kidman rarely travelled the back country without an Aboriginal guide and offsider. Sit with what that actually means. The empire that was coming, the largest landholding in the modern world, was built on knowledge that was not Kidman's at all. It was Aboriginal knowledge of Aboriginal country, handed to a white boy in a creek bank dugout by a man whose surname history did not record. Everything Kidman would later do, every clever purchase, every mob of cattle walked 1,000 miles and sold fat, rested on that foundation. We will come back to it honestly later in this story, because the land he learned to read so well was never, in truth, empty, and it was never really his. But for now, hold on to the friendship. It is the bedrock the whole empire is built on. And it is worth being clear about how unusual that friendship was, and how unusual it was not. Kidman was a white man in a colony built on the taking of Aboriginal land, and he profited from that taking as surely as every other pastoralist did. But the specific skills that lifted him above every rival, the ability to find water in dead country and to move stock where other men could not, he owed to a friendship most men of his class and time would never have formed and would certainly never have admitted to. He learned, and he remembered who had taught him. In an age of open contempt, that counted for something, even if it can never square the larger account. With what Billy taught him, and a small inheritance on the way, the boy began to trade, and one of his very first deals became the most famous mistake in the history of Australian business. Chapter 3. 10 bullocks for a fortune. When his mother died, a stipend came through from his grandfather's estate, and in 1878, at the age of 21, Kidman collected the balance of it, about £400. It was real money, and he used it the way he would use money for the rest of his life. He bought and he sold cattle, horses, whatever the growing mining towns of the inland needed. He ran a butcher's shop at the Cobar copper rush. He set up a store. He carted supplies in and copper ore out. He put the first ration store into Tibooburra when gold was struck out there. Coin by coin, deal by deal, he was building capital in the hardest, driest country in the colony, learning a lesson most men never learn, that the surest profit in a boom is not the gold, but selling the shovels, the flour and the beef to the men chasing it. It is a pattern worth naming, because it is the quiet engine of the whole life. Kidman almost never chased the glamorous prize himself. He sold to the men who did. Let another man break his back and his heart chasing copper or gold. Kidman would take a steady, certain profit feeding and supplying and carting for him, and he would take it in every season, boom or bust. He was, in the language of a later age, selling the picks and shovels rather than digging for the gold, and he was about to apply that same cold, patient logic to the single hardest problem in all of Australian grazing. And it was around this time that he made the trade that would haunt the legend forever. Kidman came into a 1/14th share of the mine at Broken Hill, that same Mount Gipps ground he had once worked as a sacked bullock driver. He got the share, the story goes, in exchange for 10 working bullocks. And then he sold it, early and cheap, for something like £150. That 1/14th share would later be estimated to be worth well over £1 million. The fortune that got away. Now, let me correct something on the record, because you will hear it repeated as fact, and it is false. People say Kidman once owned 12% of BHP. He did not. It was a single 1/14th share, held briefly and sold early. A 14th, not a 5th. The myth swells in the retelling because we love our cattle kings to have brushed against a greater fortune and let it slip. The truth is smaller and much sharper than the legend. He looked at a share in a hole in the ground and a mob of living cattle, and he backed the cattle every time. And in the dust of those inland towns, on the hides of the stock he traded, a mark began to appear, the S. Kidman and Company brand. A plain, simple thing, burned into hide. It would outlive him, and it would outlive everyone who came after him. He had made his decision. His fortune was not under the ground. It was on top of it, on 4 legs, walking. But the country that carried that fortune was killing cattle by the tens of thousands. And Sidney Kidman thought he knew why, and exactly what to do about it. Chapter 4. The Chain of Stations. Here is the idea that built the empire, and it is worth slowing right down for, because it is the single most important thing in this whole story, and the documentaries that skip past it to talk about snakes and campfires miss the entire point of the man. The enemy in the Australian inland is drought. The rain does not come when you want it, or where you need it. A station that is green and fat one year is red dust and dead cattle the next. And there is nothing an ordinary grazier can do but stand at the fence and watch his herd starve. Most cattlemen tried to solve this the obvious way, by owning the best-watered single property they could afford and praying. Kidman did the opposite. He looked at a map of the continent's great inland river systems, the Georgina, the Diamantina and Cooper Creek, the channels that run down into the vast salt pan of Lake Eyre. And he saw something that nobody else had thought to join together. Those rivers were a road, not a road of dirt, a road of feed and water running north to south through the dead heart of Australia. So instead of buying one good property, Kidman began acquiring, mostly by lease, a chain of stations, one after another, strung down the line of those watercourses from the tropical north all the way to the railheads of South Australia. The logic was simple, and it was genius. Breed the cattle up north, where the country was enormous and cheap. Then, when drought struck one link in the chain, walk the herd down the rivers to the next station that still had grass and water, and then the next and the next, all the way to the southern markets. His cattle could always move toward the feed. He had, in effect, drought-proofed a herd across half a continent. The Australian Dictionary of Biography credits him with exactly this vision, growing and fattening cattle on the remote northern stations, and bringing them down the lines of stations along the great inland rivers to the southern markets, in top condition. Read that again, because it is the whole man in a single sentence. He did not beat the drought by owning better land. He beat it by owning a route. Later, he would run the entire network by telegram, wiring instructions to his station managers across thousands of miles of nothing, moving something like 1,000 head of cattle a week toward Adelaide, a single mind at the centre of a web the size of Western Europe. He was not the first great drover, of course. Men like Nathaniel Buchanan had blazed the tracks a generation before him. But Buchanan opened the country. Kidman organised it. In 1885, at Kapunda, Sidney married Isabel Brown Wright, a schoolteacher, and founded the family that would carry the name. But the true marriage of his life was to that idea, the chain. The first link went into the ground at a place called Owen Springs in 1886, and from that single lease, the map of inland Australia began, quietly, year by year, to disappear beneath his brand. Chapter 5. The map turns to his brand. Once the idea had proven itself, the expansion was relentless, and the numbers are genuinely difficult to hold in your head. Owen Springs, in the Territory, in 1886. Annandale, his first Queensland property in the Channel Country in 1896. In 1899, he formally founded S. Kidman Company, the vehicle that would hold the whole sprawling thing together, and then the map of the inland simply began to change colour. By 1903, Kidman owned or part-owned around 38,000 square miles of country, a run of stations stretching from Carlton Hill in Western Australia, across the Northern Territory, all the way down to Macumba in South Australia. By 1908, it was 50,000 square miles, and in 1909 alone, he made the purchases that turned a very large cattle operation into something without precedent anywhere on earth. He bought a great swathe of the Channel Country, borrowing £50,000 against a £100,000 price to secure Durham Downs and the stations around it. And in partnership with the British firm Bovril Australian Estates, he took Victoria River Downs in the Territory and Carlton Hill in the Kimberley for around £200,000. Try to picture the true scale of what he was assembling, because the words thousands of square miles simply wash over you. A single one of his big northern stations could be larger than an entire English county. His holdings, laid end to end down those river systems, spanned the distance from the tropics to the temperate south, a spread so vast that one man who has ridden that country put it in terms you can actually feel. The distance Kidman moved his cattle, he said, was like driving from Canada to Mexico, like walking a herd from England to Turkey. This was not a farm. It was not even a ranch, in the way the word is normally used. It was a private grazing territory, larger than most of the nations that sat in the League of Nations, run out of an office in Adelaide by a man who had started with 5 shillings. And the growth did not slow with age. Station after station came under the brand, each one a fresh link welded onto the chain. There were the Channel Country runs fed by the Cooper and the Diamantina, the Great Territory holdings, the Kimberley flagships in the far northwest, and properties down through New South Wales into South Australia. By the First World War, Kidman was already a millionaire, and the newspapers had handed him the title that would follow him to the grave and beyond: the Cattle King. It is not a name a man gives himself. It is a name a country gives a man when it cannot quite believe what he has done. He had taken the emptiest, harshest, least wanted country on the continent, the country other men fled, and turned it, link by link, into the largest private landholding on earth. But here is the part that almost nobody knows, the part that changes how you have to see the entire thing. For all those hundreds of thousands of square miles, for all the maps coloured in with his brand, Sir Sidney Kidman barely owned any of it at all. Chapter 6. He never owned it. This is the twist the legend leaves out, and a sharp-eyed viewer of the old documentaries once spotted it and said so bluntly. Kidman was not, for the most part, a landowner. He was a leaseholder. The overwhelming majority of that vast empire was Crown land, held under pastoral lease from the government, not owned outright as freehold. He controlled around 3% of the Australian continent. He owned, in the way you own the house you live in, almost none of it. That is not a criticism. It was, in fact, another piece of the same genius. Freehold cost enormous capital to buy and lock away. Leasehold let him control staggering areas of country for a fraction of the outlay, and pour his real money instead into stock and into the chain itself. But it matters, because it quietly changes what the word empire even means here. He did not own a twelfth of Australia. He held the right to run cattle across it. And that raises the harder question, the one that sits underneath this entire story, and it deserves to be faced squarely rather than skipped. Whose land was it, really? Long before it was Crown land for a government to lease to a cattleman, it was Aboriginal country, and in any moral sense it never stopped being that. The whole northern cattle industry that Kidman built upon ran to an enormous degree on Aboriginal labour. In Queensland in 1886, more than half of the entire pastoral workforce was Aboriginal. Across the north, Aboriginal stockmen were the very backbone of the enterprise, some of the finest horsemen and cattle handlers the country has ever produced. And for decade after decade, a great many of them were paid not in wages, but in rations, in flour and tea and tobacco, for the labour that built other men's fortunes. And the very ground at the dead centre of Kidman's empire, Anna Creek, is the country of the Arabana people, who in 2012 had their native title formally recognised over nearly 69,000 square kilometres of it, including Anna Creek itself and Lake Eyre. So hold two things in your head at once, because both of them are true, and the man deserves the whole truth. On the one hand, the boy who learned everything he knew from Billy was, by the brutal standards of his era, remembered for dealing decently with Aboriginal people. Some of them called him Big Fella Kidman. On the other hand, his empire, like every pastoral empire in this country without exception, was built on land that was taken and worked in large part by people who were barely paid for it. Do not let anyone hand you only one of those halves. When the world went to war, the cattle king gave it plains and horses and beef. And then, flush with fame and certain of his own judgment, he tried to build something he could not ride. Chapter 7. Plains, Horses and One Great Failure. By the time of the First World War, Sidney Kidman was not merely rich. He was a national figure, and in the war years his name became, in the words of his own biographers, a byword for generosity. He gave the war effort fighter planes. He gave ambulances. He gave around 200 horses for the cavalry campaigns in the Middle East, along with shipments of frozen beef and wool. And he gave it at the very time that drought had savaged his own operation, with stock losses running past £1 million. He was pouring money and cattle into the nation with one hand, while the dry sky was stripping it away from him with the other. In 1921, he was knighted for that war service, and the runaway boy with 5 shillings became Sir Sidney Kidman. The honour came, fittingly, the day after he had handed over his grand family home at Kapunda, a house called Eringa, to the South Australian government, to be used as a school. The boy, who had almost no schooling of his own, gave a mansion away to educate other people's children. It fit the man exactly. For all his legendary tightness with a shilling, Kidman gave on a scale that startled people, and he gave where it was useful rather than where it would be seen. Homes and jobs held open for returned soldiers. Care quietly arranged for the widows of the men who did not come back. £1,000 and a half share in one of his own cattle stations handed to the Salvation Army. He had grown up with nothing, and he never entirely stopped being the boy with 5 shillings in his pocket, but he had worked out, somewhere along the way, what a fortune was actually for. And then he overreached. Because even Sidney Kidman, it turned out, could make a spectacular mistake, and this one is worth telling, because it is the single time the man who could read 1,000 miles of open country badly misjudged the ground under his feet. During the war, the Commonwealth had called for wooden ships to be built, timber being available when steel was not, and Kidman went into shipbuilding, forming a company called Kidman and Majo, with 2 engineer brothers, at Putney on the Parramatta River in Sydney. They employed hundreds of men, felling and squaring huge timber up on the north coast of New South Wales, bush carpenters working alongside skilled shipwrights. But when the war ended, the government cut the contract from 6 ships down to 2. The first vessel, reported at the time as the largest wooden ship ever built in Australia, was damaged as it was launched and failed to win its certification. Years of bitter litigation followed, and in the end, in 1923, the ships were simply burned where they lay. Kidman lost a great deal of money and reportedly said his deepest regret was not the money at all, but that all that magnificent craftsmanship by the finest axemen on the north coast had gone for nothing. The strategist who could read the inland could not, it turned out, read the sea. By the time he was finished, one man's brand ran on up to 3% of a continent. And then, on a spring day in 1935, the Cattle King died. Chapter 8. 3% of a continent. Let us stand for one moment at the very summit and look properly at what the boy with the one-eyed horse had actually built, because it is close to impossible to believe. At its peak, Sir Sidney Kidman's empire is variously reckoned to have covered somewhere between 83,000 and 107,000 square miles. Take the upper figure and you are looking at around 3.7% of the entire Australian mainland, held or controlled by one man and his company. 68 separate stations. On them ran something like 176,000 head of cattle and well over 200,000 sheep. His country reached from the Gulf of Carpentaria in the tropical north down to the Flinders Ranges in the temperate south. To this day, no individual has ever controlled a larger share of this continent, and there is no serious rival anywhere in the modern world for a private landholding built on that scale. There is a lovely thread that runs out of the empire and into another Australian legend, and it is worth a moment because people always ask about it. A young man named Reginald Williams worked for a time on Kidman's Eringar station, and in the early 1930s, that same young man got one of his very first orders, for a pack saddle from Sir Sidney Kidman himself. The few pounds Kidman paid helped Reginald Murray Williams start a little leathercraft business in a shed in Adelaide. That business became R.M. Williams, two great outback names, and the elder gave the younger his start. The town of Kapunda, north of Adelaide, was Kidman country through and through. For about 30 years he held his famous horse sales there, hundreds of animals paraded and auctioned off, and he charged the public admission simply to watch, then gave the proceeds away to charity. The main pub in the town was called the Sir Sidney Kidman Hotel right up until 2010. In Kapunda, the Cattle King was never a legend on a page. He was the man who had put the town on the map, and everybody in it knew his face. Kidman was no saint about his money, and the record is honest on that score. In 1924, the federal government came after him for unpaid land tax, issuing a writ for a staggering £166,000. After years of wrangling all the way to the High Court, the matter was finally settled for about $25,000. A flawed titan then, hard, frugal and sharp in a deal. A man who never drank or smoked or swore, who said jolly tinkers where other men would have cursed, and who counted every shilling to the end of his life, as though he was still the boy who had owned only 5. On the 2nd of September 1935, Sir Sidney Kidman died in Adelaide at the age of 78. His funeral cortege stretched more than a mile and a half through the streets, a nation paying its respects to the runaway who had made himself the Cattle King. The following year, the writer Ion Idries published a romantic best-selling account of his life, and the legend was set in print. He had built a 100-year empire and handed it to his blood, and it was his blood in the end that would let it go. Chapter 9. The Name Bred Out. Here is the quiet tragedy of the second half of this story, and there is no villain anywhere in it, only time and distance and the slow dilution of a family across the generations. When Sidney died, the empire did not pass cleanly to a single heir in the way an old king might have wished. It fractured almost at once. A large part of the enterprise went to the family of his son-in-law, the Reeds. Another branch, the heirs line, took over the running of S. Kidman and Company itself. His only surviving son, Walter, guided the family's interests until his own death in 1970. And then the generations did what generations always do. They multiplied and they scattered. The blood of the Cattle King flowed outward, into new surnames, across the country and then across the oceans, into branches of the family in Britain and the United States, who had never once seen a Kidman station, and never would. There is no real blame in that. It is simply what happens to a family fortune, given enough time. The founder builds it with his own hands and his whole life. His children watch him build it. His grandchildren grow up on the stories. And his great-grandchildren, and their children after them, inherit a thing they have never once touched, held in trust across oceans, meaning a little less with every generation. The astonishing thing is not that the Kidman family eventually sold. The astonishing thing is that they held it, whole and under the one name, for as long as they did. 116 years, 5 generations, through droughts and wars and depressions that broke almost everyone around them. The empire did not fail. The bloodline simply, slowly, loosened its grip. By 2015, the company that still carried his name was owned by around 64 separate shareholders, spread across 5 generations and 3 countries. And in the company's own telling, the Kidman name itself had, in their words, been bred out of the family tree. The people who now owned the largest pastoral company in Australian history were, many of them, distant descendants for whom the whole thing was an inheritance on paper, a shareholding, a line in a portfolio. It was not a way of life. It was not a thing you rose in the black cold before dawn to ride out across. And an asset, unlike a birthright, can always be sold. So in April 2015, the decision was made. S. Kidman and Company, 116 years old, debt-free, still running its cattle across around 100,000 square kilometres of Australia, was quietly put up for sale. The accountants at Ernst & Young were brought in to handle it. One family member, watching it all unfold, called it a tragedy born of the selfishness of descendants who could no longer see the bigger picture. Others simply saw good, clean business, a chance to turn red dirt and old leases into money in the bank. Both of them, perhaps, were right, but the moment that sign went up, the story stopped being a cattle story at all. It became something far bigger and far rawer, and it went straight to the heart of a question this country is still arguing about today. Who exactly is allowed to own Australia? Chapter 10. Who owns it now? The sale of the Kidman Empire became, in the words of the Treasurer himself, a transaction that aroused public comment like no other rural property sale in the nation's history. And the reason was simple, and it was raw. The most likely buyers were Chinese, and a great many Australians did not like it. The early running was made by Chinese bidders, among them the Shanghai Pengxin Group and a company called Genius Link. But in November 2015, the Treasurer, Scott Morrison, blocked the sale to foreign interests on national interest grounds. The problem was partly Anna Creek itself. The largest cattle station on Earth sits partly inside the Woomera Prohibited Area, a secret defence weapons testing range, and the government would not see that pass into foreign hands. A second, restructured Chinese-led bid came back in early 2016 through a company called Dakang. And in April of 2016, Morrison blocked that one too, ruling that an asset this large, this much a piece of the nation itself, was contrary to the national interest. Twice now, the door had been shut in the same face. What followed was a thoroughly Australian drama. In late 2016, a consortium of 4 wealthy Australian grazier families launched their own bid, purely Australian money, needing no foreign approval at all, promising to carve the great empire up between them. And against them came the richest woman in the country. Gina Rinehart's company, Hancock Prospecting, in a joint venture with the Chinese group Shanghai Creed, formed a company called Australian Outback Beef, with Hancock holding 2/3 and the Chinese partner 1/3. The two sides pushed the price up between them until, in the end, Rinehart's group won it, at $386.5 million. On the 9th of December 2016, the Treasurer approved the deal. And crucially, Anna Creek, the defence-sensitive jewel in the whole crown, was carved out of the sale and sold separately to an Australian family, the Williams Cattle Company, keeping the largest station on earth in Australian hands. So who owns it now? The bulk of what Sidney Kidman built is controlled today by Gina Rinehart, with a Chinese company holding a third of it. And even that empire has since been broken up and sold down, station by station, until, by 2023, only a small handful of the old leases still ran under the Kidman name. Before we leave, 3 things the record insists we set straight, because people ask them over and over. The actress, Nicole Kidman, is not descended from the Cattle King. Her family came from a separate English Kidman line. The famous book Kings in Grass Castles is not about him at all. It is the saga of the Durack family. And he never owned 12% of BHP. It was a single 14th share, sold cheap and sold early. Strip all of that away and here is what remains. Drive out to Anna Creek today and the S. Kidman and Company brand is still there, burned into the hides of the cattle, still marking the red country a boy once learned to read from a man named Billy. Think about the arithmetic one final time. 5 shillings and a one-eyed horse called Cyclops. From that, a boy with no father and no schooling built the largest landholding in the modern history of the world, not by owning the best country, but by never truly owning any of it and always knowing how to walk his cattle to water. His blood inherited it, and his blood in the end sold it, part of it overseas. The brand still marks the cattle, but the country it made is owned by someone else now.